I still remember that morning as if it's burned into my memory. The sun had barely risen, and the world outside my window looked calm. Too calm for what was about to come. I used to believe peaceful mornings meant good days ahead. That belief died the day I found out the truth. My name's Daniel, and until that day, I thought I had everything a man could ask for. A steady job, a warm home, and a woman I believed loved me more than anything. Her name was Emily. We'd been married for 6 years. And then there was Ryan, my childhood friend, my brother in everything but blood. If you had told me back then that those two would be the reason I'd lose trust and love, I would have laughed in your face. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Emily was still asleep beside me, her phone resting on the nightstand. She had started sleeping with it face down lately, something she never used to do. I remember thinking it was odd, but I brushed it off. Relationships thrive on trust, right? That's what I kept telling myself. I got ready for work quietly, made myself coffee, and left a note for her like I always did. Have a good day. Love you. Simple words that suddenly feel like a joke now. At the office, things were busy, meetings, deadlines, the usual grind. But around noon, I got a call from my manager saying the client meeting was canceled, and I could take the rest of the day off. I was happy, thinking I could surprise Emily, maybe take her out for lunch. I even bought her favorite flowers from the shop near our house, white lilies. If I had known what waited behind that door, I would have thrown those flowers away and never gone home. When I reached our street, everything looked so normal. Kids playing, the mailman doing his rounds, just another day. I parked quietly, trying to be sweet, like in those romantic scenes where a husband surprises his wife. But the moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. It was quiet, too quiet. I could hear faint music playing upstairs. Emily loved music while getting ready. I smiled to myself. Maybe she was planning something too. Then I heard a laugh. A man's laugh. Familiar. Too familiar. My heart froze. I stood still, trying to process it. Maybe Ryan had dropped by. He had a habit of doing that sometimes. But then came another sound. Softer. Intimate. I won't describe it. I don't have to. Every man who's ever been betrayed knows that sound. My hand went numb. The flowers slipped from my grip, landing softly on the floor, petals scattering like the pieces of my trust. I didn't storm upstairs. I didn't shout. I just walked, slow and silent. My mind wasn't working. I wish it had. I wish I'd just left right there, but I kept moving. Like something inside me needed to see, to make the pain real. When I reached the bedroom door, it was half open. The music was louder now. I pushed it just enough to see them. Ryan, Emily, together. Time stopped. I can't tell you how long I stood there. Maybe seconds, maybe hours. My breath was shallow, my heartbeat echoing in my ears like thunder. They didn't even notice me at first. And when they did, the look on their faces, shock, guilt, fear. Ryan tried to speak first. Dan, I can explain. I remember raising my hand, not to hit him, not to shout, just to make him stop talking. I looked at Emily, and she couldn't even meet my eyes. She covered herself and started crying. Funny thing about tears. When you've already broken someone, they don't mean much. I walked out without saying a word. Down the stairs, out the door. Outside, the lilies were still scattered on the floor. I picked one up, stared at it for a moment, and whispered to myself, "She'll never see me the same again, and I'll never be the same again either." I spent that night in my car by the old lake where Ryan and I used to hang out as teenagers. The same place where I once told him I'd found the one when I first met Emily. The irony stung. I remember staring at the reflection of the moon on the water, replaying everything in my head, every laugh, every memory, the lies hidden in plain sight. I didn't cry that night. I couldn't. It was like my body had run out of emotion. I just sat there thinking about how betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people you trust the most. By dawn, I made a decision. I wasn't going to destroy them with anger or violence. No, my revenge would be quieter, smarter, and unforgettable. I would take from them what they valued most: peace, reputation, and control. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I'd make sure they'd remember what they did to me for the rest of their lives.
That was the day everything changed. The day Daniel, the man who trusted too easily, died. And in his place, someone colder, sharper, and unrecognizable was born. After that night by the lake, I could have walked into the office the next morning and told everyone, screamed it from the top of the stairs, exposed them in the rawest way. Part of me wanted that. Part of me wanted to break them on the spot and then leave, bleeding with my pride patched up. But rage, I learned, is a blunt instrument. It hammers and leaves scars on the hands that swing it. I wanted something different, a justice measured, one they would feel every day. So I did something worse. I chose silence. I let the world assume everything was normal while the real work began. Silence wasn't emptiness. It became my weapon. I went to work. I laughed at jokes. I answered emails and I smiled at coworkers. I listened to Ryan's voice at the office, the same easy cadence I'd heard since we were kids, while inside, my stomach twisted with sick disbelief. Emily would text me like nothing happened. "Don't forget dinner tonight," or "Pick up milk on your way home." I kept those texts unread, filed them away like evidence. Every small, ordinary thing they did became a tape I could play in my head to remember how ordinary the betrayal had been. The hard part was pretending not to know. People can't live with that kind of truth in the air and ignore it forever, so I learned to act like I didn't feel anything. It's amazing how many things a person can do under the guise of normalcy. For 2 weeks I watched. I didn't follow them like some lunatic. I watched from a distance, cataloging details. When Ryan left his apartment in the morning, did he lock the door? Did he take his watch? When Emily left for work, did she look back at the house? Habits matter. People reveal themselves in habits. I became a student of their routines. I noted every little lie and omission, the times Emily suddenly had late shifts, the weekends Ryan had to work but refused to say where, the calls Emily took in the bathroom, the way Ryan's voice changed when he thought no one was listening. I collected these moments like stones, small, heavy, and perfect for building something that would one day collapse their world. But you should know, planning revenge like this doesn't make you immune to pain. If anything, it made me feel it more. Watching them together, laughing over something I once thought was ours, felt like day after day of tiny cuts. The silence around me was thick with what I couldn't say. Friends asked if I was okay. I lied. "Everything's fine." That phrase became my mask. At night, when the house was quiet, the silence would swallow me. I couldn't sleep, not really. My mind replayed their faces, and I wondered how many other small betrayals had been smoothed away by smiles. The worst part was the memory of ordinary love, holding her hand at crosswalks, Ryan and I playing cards until dawn. Those memories were now poisoned with knowledge. The mind is a cruel curator. It preserves the good with the bad, and you live with both like a ghost in your chest. I knew, logically, that revenge wouldn't fill the hollow she had created. Still, I couldn't bring myself to ask for divorce immediately. That might have been the easy way out, or at least an honest one.
I wanted them to feel the slow unraveling, to understand how full of small betrayals love can be. I wanted them to lose the foundation they'd built together: trust, security, and time. So I did what any careful person does when they decide to dismantle something delicate. I gathered allies. Not people to fight for me, but people who would help me see clearly. I started with a private investigator, not the dramatic kind you see on TV, but a quiet professional who understood discretion. I needed facts, dates, places, proof beyond my memory. I couldn't rely solely on what I'd felt. Feelings are slippery and can betray you in their own way. Facts are heavier. Facts can be shown, replayed, and used. The investigator confirmed what I already knew, but the confirmation changed something inside me. Seeing proof in black and white, photos, timestamps, messages, made the decision to act less about emotion and more about consequence. It was a strange relief. Suddenly, the plan felt less like revenge and more like a necessary correction. With evidence in hand, I started a different kind of preparation, quietly protecting myself. I met with a lawyer to understand my rights, to learn how to separate myself from the life I'd built with Emily without leaving holes they could hide behind. I set up a separate bank account, made a list of assets, and took copies of important documents. This was practical work, far from the romanticized visions of revenge. Still, it ate at me. Bills, paperwork, and a crushing, bureaucratic stripping down of everything that once felt secure. There was a loneliness in those months that people who haven't been betrayed won't recognize. When your world collapses, it doesn't leave a crater big enough to see from space. It leaves tiny fissures. Friends choosing sides, family avoiding the subject, the way people shift in a room when your name is mentioned. I kept my mouth shut because every word could change the plan. Silence meant control. But silence also forced reflection. I began to ask myself hard questions. Were there signs I missed? Had I been blind because I wanted to be? Was I complicit in my own undoing because I chose to ignore small things? These reflections weren't kind. They were necessary. They taught me that anyone can be fooled when they want to be, and that trust can be both a blessing and a vulnerability.
Still, I refused to let bitterness be the story's end. I channeled that hurt into structure. I mapped out the things I wanted to take back: dignity, financial fairness, and the narrative. If they wanted to live with the lie that their betrayal would be swept under a rug, I would make sure the rug was taken away and shown to everyone. One night, months into my quiet work, Emily came home late and found me sitting at the kitchen table, a folder open in front of me. The house felt different, colder, like a room where the lights were dimmed to hide the dirt. She sat down opposite me, and for a moment I saw the woman I had married. She hesitated, eyes searching mine for mercy or anger. That hesitation was my cue. "Do you have something to tell me?" she asked, voice small. I could have unloaded everything then: the proof, the investigators' reports, the fury. But I kept my voice steady. "I know," I said quietly. She recoiled like I'd slapped her. "What do you mean?" she whispered, but the tremor in her voice told me I wouldn't be lying. "I know about Ryan," I said. "I know about the nights, the texts, the excuses." She started to cry. She tried to explain, to turn it into a story of loneliness and mistakes. I listened the way a judge listens to pleas, with patience but without leniency. When she asked for forgiveness, I didn't answer immediately. Forgiveness is not cursory. It's a currency that I no longer owned. That night, she begged. I looked at her and felt both pity and anger. Pity because I still loved the memory of her. Anger because she destroyed what she had without regard for the fallout.
I told her we would talk tomorrow. I told her to sleep. Then I closed my eyes and imagined the future I would carve out. Controlled, purposeful, and far from the chaos she'd created. The silence before the storm is not idle. It's a pressure cooker. It builds and hums until the first valve opens and steam escapes. I felt that pressure every day, a steady, terrible reminder of what I'd decided to do. I had chosen to be patient in a world that demanded immediate, dramatic emotion. And patience in revenge is a cold kind of strength. When the first small piece of my plan slid into place, the subtle reallocation of joint accounts, the reassignment of certain assets, the careful sharing of certain documents with my lawyer, I felt a sliver of control return. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something as simple and human as breathing again. I had no illusions that their fall would be quick or clean. People like Ryan and Emily have webs to hide behind. But deep down, I knew that when everything fell away, they would look back and wonder when they'd allowed the silence to take root. And I would stand there, not triumphant, but steady, and let them face the consequence of every small cruelty they thought they could hide behind a laugh. Once I decided to act, the next step was obvious. I needed more than a memory and the sting of betrayal. Memory is a dangerous thing to rely on in courtrooms, in conversations with family, or when you want people to believe you. Memories bend, voices falter, and emotion can be dismissed as bitterness. Facts, though, photos, messages, receipts, are heavy. They don't bend under pressure. They sit there and stare back. So, I started collecting. Quietly, methodically. Every relationship built on lies has a pattern, and patterns leave traces. My job was to find the seams and pull them open. The investigator I hired was older than me, gray at the temples, and unfazed by the kinds of stories people bring when they suspect infidelity. He moved like someone who had seen too many broken homes to be stirred by the emotion of one. That stoicism helped. It kept the work clinical when my hands wanted to shake. He provided the first layer: timestamps and locations. Seeing their pictures with dates was like watching a movie you hoped wouldn't exist. There were images of Emily and Ryan at a cafe 2 towns over at 3 a.m. A late-night motel check-in with a name I didn't recognize. Photos of them together in places where Emily had told me she was alone, at work, or at a friend's house. Each image tightened something in my chest. Each one was proof that the life I thought I knew was a construct they'd choreographed without me. But the photos were only the start. The investigator also gave me call logs and copies of messages. The messages were the cruelest. Jokes in the morning, miss you notes at midnight, affectionate nicknames that I had never heard. The casual familiarity in the texts was what hurt the most. It wasn't the grand declarations or the dramatic scenes. It was the small daily betrayals that proved this had been going on for a long time. I saved everything. I made backups. I put copies in safety deposit boxes and emailed encrypted files to an account only I could access. I began to understand that evidence is not just proof, it's a lifeline. You can be gaslit by an explanation, but you can't gaslight a time-stamped photo.
More than once, I caught myself staring at a message and trying to find a redeeming explanation. Human beings are experts at rationalizing. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe there was context I didn't have. But the pile of little inconsistencies grew until context no longer mattered. The pattern had formed a picture I couldn't unsee. There were moments when the evidence felt cruelly invasive. I was peeking behind curtains, reading private words, and following the trail that my wife and best friend had left while they thought no one watched. Part of me recoiled at that intimacy, but I had to remind myself they violated the covenant of trust first. If intimacy in the service of truth felt invasive, it was only because they had made privacy into a weapon. Gathering evidence also uncovered an ugly truth about people who lie together. They coordinate narratives. When I confronted mutual friends, their stories were inconsistent. A dinner that one claimed was a work event became just friends when retold by another. One of Emily's co-workers mentioned how Emily began changing her schedule months ago. She'd said it was for a class. Ryan's excuses shifted depending on who asked. Those inconsistencies mattered. They showed a small culture of concealment that extended beyond the two of them. I learned to be patient with the work, trusting that small details would eventually braid into an irrefutable rope. I trailed receipts back to one restaurant where Emily and Ryan had been seen several times. There were hotel records tied to Ryan's name and an alternate phone number Emily used when she thought no one would find it. The investigator even found a burner phone, a cheap prepaid device with messages that stopped being coded and started being plain. The emotional cost of looking was high. There were nights I sat in my chair with the files spread around me, reading messages aloud, just to hear them in my own voice. The casual "love you" that meant nothing when it came from a stranger was brutal when it had once been mine. I found voicemails that played like a dagger they had sharpened together. I cried in ways I didn't admit to anyone, not because I felt weak, but because grief has many languages, and sometimes silent sobs are the loudest. Despite the pain, the evidence gave me something else: clarity. When everything is a mess inside your head, facts are the scaffolding that let you build something sane. I could no longer doubt myself. The truth was heavy and cold, but it was real. With proof in hand, I started to think about how to use it, not in the melodramatic way you might expect, plastering it on social media or confronting them in a crowded restaurant. That kind of spectacle felt cheap. I wanted something that would matter where it counted, to family, to legal systems, and to the people who shared my life. So, I organized the material: a chronology, photographs arranged by date, messages printed and annotated, receipts cross-referenced with location data. The investigator assembled a neat file that looked like the portfolio of someone preparing for a case. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. This was going to be about consequences. At the same time, I started mending my own life in quiet ways. I reached out to a therapist, not to grovel or to make someone else fix me, but to understand how to not let this define me forever. I told myself revenge could not be the only path. I needed to plan for life after the fallout. The balance between creating consequences and rebuilding myself became a daily negotiation. I wanted them to suffer the truth, yes, but I also wanted to make sure I'd be able to step into sunlight again when the storm had passed. There were legal considerations too. The investigators' reports had to be collected in ways that wouldn't be dismissed in court. Chain of custody, verified timestamps, and credible witnesses mattered. The last thing I wanted was for a judge to suggest my evidence was fabricated because I hadn't been diligent. So I made sure everything had a source, a date, and a way to be verified. As the files grew, so did my resolve. The web of lies they had spun stretched into every corner of my life, but where the web touched the light, it looked fragile. Lies are strong in the dark because they don't have to stand up to scrutiny. Shine light on them, and they show their seams. But even with everything assembled, I felt an odd mix of emotions. There was relief in having proof, There was sorrow in seeing the scale of deception laid out in neat columns, and there was a simmering anger that had nowhere to go yet. It wasn't enough to collect evidence. The difficult work was deciding how to make those facts meaningful. I thought about telling my parents, my siblings, close friends. I thought about going straight to Emily with the folder and saying, "You owe me your truth." But the folder was not a weapon to swing in a moment of rage. It was a tool. Tools are most effective when used thoughtfully. So I waited. I sharpened the edges of my case. I made sure every loose thread was tied down. The web they had spun would someday be pulled apart, and when it unraveled, everyone who had been passive, complicit, or naive would see what I had seen. In the quiet of my apartment, under the dull light of a desk lamp, I stacked the evidence into a box and locked it away. It felt ceremonial, like burying a truth until the right time to dig it up. I knew the excavation would be painful, but whatever came next, it would be done with a steady hand and a clear mind. I had transformed from a hurt man into someone who could build a case for justice.
And that, I told myself, was the only kind of revenge that would matter. When you decide to take the long road of measured revenge, the first act is always the hardest, turning evidence and anger into action without becoming the thing you hate. For weeks, I had held the folder like a sacred object, proof that the life I thought I had was invented. Now it was time to make it mean something. I didn't want fireworks. I didn't want them to scream or to be humiliated in front of strangers. I wanted consequences that fit the betrayal, precise, unavoidable, and quietly devastating. The idea was not to destroy for the thrill of it, but to dismantle the illusion they were living under, the illusion that your choices don't ripple outward. The first place I went was where truth has teeth, the law. I met with my lawyer again, not in a panic, but with a plan. The lawyer listened, leafed through the files, and asked practical, steady questions. Do you want separation? Do you want to pursue custody? Are you seeking financial settlement? There were no dramatic speeches, only the calculus of consequence. We talked about asset division, signatures, joint accounts, the dry mechanics that keep lives together long after romance fades. The attorney's calm made the whole thing feel less like personal vengeance and more like justice. With counsel's advice, I began to take control in ways that were legal and irreversible. I moved certain funds into separate accounts I had quietly established. I changed passwords to accounts that were strictly mine. I put protections in place for our shared property so that nothing could disappear without notice. These acts felt small and petty when compared to the betrayal, but they mattered. They stripped away the safety net my wife and Ryan assumed would remain intact. There are also reputational walls to consider. Emily worked in a tight-knit industry where reputation was currency. I never wanted to ruin someone's career out of spite, but I also couldn't sit idle while the person who had promised fidelity lied to my face and continued a secret life with someone I trusted above all. So I did something simple. I presented facts where facts mattered. I provided a copy of the evidence to her employer through the right channels, not to humiliate, but to ensure transparency if questions arose that might affect the company. I chose discretion over spectacle. The goal was to let institutions make decisions based on truth, not gossip. Ryan's situation required the same measured approach. He worked freelance, and reputation is the keystone for freelancers. I contacted a professional association he belonged to and provided them with a factual summary, dates, documented evidence, and verifiable sources. Again, this wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was accountability. When people lie together in the dark, those lies tend to touch others. Letting organizations know the facts allowed consequences to follow through proper channels. I could feel some readers raising an eyebrow. Isn't this vindictive? The answer is complicated. The difference between vindictiveness and accountability is how the action is framed. Accountability is about consequences for behavior that affects others. Vindictiveness is spectacle driven by emotion. I was meticulously avoiding the latter. There were practical moments where the quiet strikes hurt the most, the small confrontations, the reshuffling of day-to-day life. I returned the keys to places she'd moved into with Ryan, canceled subscriptions that were jointly billed, and took down pictures that had once been happy artifacts. These acts did not make headlines, they made the space between us tangible. When she came home and found certain things missing, the bank card that had been hers to use, a key that no longer worked, the realization would be slow and corrosive. I didn't savor it, I observed it like a scientist watching a reaction. There are also strategic moments of truth. I set up meetings with people who mattered to both of them, family members, a couple of mutual friends, and presented the facts calmly, letting them process without spectacle. Some were shocked, some defensive, and some chose not to believe. That stung, but it was a necessary part of the plan. Let the people who value honesty most decide where they stood. One night, Emily woke to find an envelope on the kitchen table. No note, no flourish, just the heavy folder with copies of messages and photos laid out as plainly as one would lay out financial papers. It was a gesture meant to remove ambiguity. Ambiguity is comfort for the guilty. Clarity is discomfort. She called me that night, voice trembling, and asked me, "Why did you do this?" I answered with the only thing that could be true. Because I want the truth to be visible. I want us both to live with the consequences of our choices. Her silence after that call was a kind of surrender. For the first time since the discovery, I saw fear on her face. Not regret exactly, but the realization that her decisions had instigated a series of events that could not be easily stopped. What I had not foreseen was how these quiet takedowns would ripple through my own life. Some friends drifted away, unable to sit in the uncomfortable space between their loyalties. Family members prodded gently, offering solutions that never fit. The solitude felt like a punishment of its own making. I allowed it. If I expected people to watch the truth and then act, I had to accept that some would not. There were unexpected moments of grace. An old mentor reached out and offered practical advice, not to inflame the situation, but to secure myself. A coworker I barely knew put in a good word at a bank to expedite an account change. Small kindnesses like that reminded me there's always a balance. People who sever ties because of discomfort, and others who step forward when they see someone in need.
As these quiet strikes landed, a pattern emerged. The illusions Ryan and Emily had built started to wobble. The financial scaffolding loosened. The protective narratives their friends had repeated began to look thin when faced with proof. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. And methodical can be lethal in its own way. There were moments when I wondered if I had become cruel. I remember one evening, watching Ryan try to explain things to his sister. He kept stumbling, fabricating details that made him look small in more ways than one. I felt a rush, not of joy, but of confirmation. The truth had weight. It didn't need my dramatics to be felt. Still, I was careful. Revenge can teach you many things, one of which is restraint. The most effective blows are often the ones that leave a person to face the consequences of their choices rather than be crushed by you. I wanted them to remember, yes, but I also wanted to ensure that what they remembered was the cost of their betrayal, not a distorted tale told by a man who wanted to hurt them for sport. The first strike was never the end. It was an opening salvo that set the tempo. Quiet takedowns do not produce instant catharsis. Instead, they produce space. Space for the legal system to do its work, for friends and family to reconsider, and for the guilty to feel the slow implosion of a life built on deception. By the time the first month after those takedowns passed, life was irrevocably different. The dinner texts stopped coming. The house felt like a museum of a life I'd walked out of and then corrected. People started to ask questions more often than they gave statements. That was a subtle victory. Truth made people think, and in that thinking, justice found a small foothold. I won't pretend the satisfaction was pure. There were nights I lay awake, wondering if this path had hardened me. Sometimes I missed the habit of believing in people the way I used to. But then I would open the folder, look at a time-stamped message, and remember that my choices were not about punishment alone. They were about reclaiming the version of myself that didn't accept betrayal as a footnote. Revenge, when done quietly and deliberately, is less about spectacle and more about balance. The first strikes were not a performance. They were the necessary rearrangement of a life that had been lied to. And as the dominoes began to fall, I knew the true test was coming. A reckoning that would demand more than quiet moves. It would demand courage to finish what I had started without losing myself in the process. If revenge is a storm, then the fallout is the silence afterward. The heavy, aching quiet that forces everyone to reveal where they truly stand. I learned quickly that betrayal doesn't only live between two people. It bleeds outward, infecting circles of trust you thought were untouchable. In the days after the first strike, my phone became a battlefield. Some calls came from people pretending to check in, their curiosity barely disguised as concern. Others came from those who had already picked a side. The most painful ones were the neutral, the ones who said, "We don't want to get involved." Neutrality always sounds wise until it's your life being burned down. Emily's parents called first. Her mother's voice trembled on the line. "We didn't raise her for this," she said softly, as if apologizing for something she couldn't fix. Her father, though, was different. His tone was measured, almost defensive. "Son, sometimes marriages break for reasons we can't control." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Reasons we can't control? She controlled every message she sent to Ryan, every lie, every secret meeting. Control was never the issue. Morality was. Still, I kept calm. There was no point in shouting at people trying to protect their own peace. "I understand," I told them, though every word felt like ash in my mouth. But understanding doesn't erase what she did. After that call, I realized something crucial. People don't want the truth, they want comfort. And the truth is rarely comforting. My own family's reactions weren't much better. My mother cried quietly on the phone, whispering prayers between sentences. My father, ever the stoic man, said, "It's time to move on. Don't let anger eat you." He didn't understand that anger was the only thing keeping me standing. Moving on felt like a betrayal in itself, a surrender to injustice. Then there were the friends, the people who had once shared dinners, trips, and inside jokes. They became my real teachers in this period. One by one, they revealed who they truly were. Some cut me off completely, probably because Ryan had reached them first. I'd see photos on social media, barbecues, gatherings, familiar faces, and there he was, smiling in the background. The captions would say things like, "Good times with the real ones." That word, real, stabbed deeper than any knife. Others stayed in touch, but their tone had changed. Conversations were shorter, careful, like I was radioactive. "You should try to forgive," one said. "Maybe it's not as bad as it looks," another said. I wanted to laugh. Forgive? Not as bad? These were the same people who once told me they'd stand by me no matter what. I realized no matter what had fine print. But there were a few who stood firm. The quiet ones. The unexpected ones. Sarah, a coworker I barely talked to before, began checking in every morning. She never asked for details. She just said, "Don't skip breakfast today." Or, "You've got a meeting at 3, remember?" Those small reminders tethered me to reality.
Then there was Imran, my oldest friend from university. He didn't say much, just came over one evening with a bottle of water and said, "We're not drinking tonight, we're planning." Together, we mapped out my next steps, legal, emotional, and personal. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about survival. The real shock came 2 weeks later when I discovered that one of the people I had trusted most, Another friend named Hassan had been feeding Emily information. He wasn't malicious, not exactly. He just couldn't resist the role of mediator, the one who thought he could fix things by passing messages. "She's flirting too," he told me, as if that justified the betrayal. That night, I deleted his number. Not in anger, but with clarity. Small betrayals are often the most dangerous because they hide behind good intentions. The emotional weight of it all began to show physically. I stopped sleeping properly. Meals lost their taste. The apartment felt colder, emptier, even though I had removed every trace of her. Some nights I'd wake up convinced I heard her footsteps down the hall. The soft rhythm that used to mean comfort now triggered nausea. I'd sit on the couch till sunrise, staring at the wall, wondering how people rebuild from ruins. The irony was that Ryan tried to reach out during this phase. A message popped up one night. "We never meant for it to go this far. I know you're angry, but please, let's talk." Talk? The audacity left me stunned. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, reading those words again and again. We never meant for it to go this far. As if betrayal had a distance marker, as if love affairs could be measured in acceptable miles. I typed a response, deleted it, then typed again, and finally settled on silence. Silence was my new weapon. No reply, no closure, just absence. Let them both wonder what I was planning next. Let that uncertainty gnaw at them the way their betrayal gnawed at me. But even as I played the role of the avenger, something inside me began to shift. I started to see that revenge wasn't a single act. It was a process that changed the person carrying it. Each quiet strike had a cost. Each decision, even the justified ones, chipped away at the part of me that once believed in goodness. The fallout wasn't just external, it was happening inside me too. My patience with others evaporated. My laughter became mechanical. Even music, something I used to love, felt meaningless. I'd put on a song and feel nothing but static. It was as if every sound reminded me of the life that used to exist. Then came the whispers, the rumors. Somehow stories began circulating that I had overreacted, that maybe Emily had been emotionally neglected. People love rewriting tragedies to make themselves feel comfortable. The narrative changed from cheating to a marriage that fell apart. It was subtle, but it enraged me. They were erasing the truth. And in that erasure, I realized something important. Truth dies when good people stay silent. So I stopped staying silent. I began telling my story, not to gossip, but to reclaim it. I met a few close friends in person, laid out the evidence calmly, and said, "You deserve to know the truth before you choose sides." Their faces said it all. The disbelief, the guilt for ever doubting me. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The whispers quieted, replaced by uncomfortable silences in their circles. But by then, I no longer needed validation. I had already learned the hardest lesson. Not all betrayals come with warning signs, and not all friendships survive the truth. In those days, I started journaling, a habit I hadn't had since college. Each night, I wrote one sentence that began with, "Today I learned." Some entries were simple. Today I learned silence hurts more than shouting. Others were sharper. Today I learned people betray not just for love, but for convenience. Over time, those pages became my therapy. They reminded me that my story wasn't just about pain, it was about endurance. By the end of that month, the social battlefield had cleared. I had fewer friends, fewer illusions, and far less tolerance for pretense. But what remained was pure. The people still beside me were the kind who didn't flinch from the truth. As for Emily and Ryan, they were beginning to face the cracks in their own fantasy. Mutual acquaintances mentioned quiet fights, canceled plans, and awkward silences between them. The dream they had built on deceit was already rotting from within. And I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't need to lift another finger. The universe has a strange symmetry. Lies have an expiration date. The fallout phase was messy, painful, and illuminating. It stripped away not just people, but illusions. For the first time in months, I felt a hint of peace. Fragile, flickering, but real. Because sometimes justice isn't a dramatic ending. It's the quiet survival of the one who was supposed to break. There's a sound I'll never forget. Not loud, but granular, like a cup of sugar spilled across a wooden floor. It was the sound of things coming apart quietly, piece by piece. After all the evidence, the quiet strikes, and the fallout, the day came when their world started to collapse in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. It wasn't one big scene. It was 1,000 small failures that, together, sounded like thunder. It started at work. Emily's employer, the one I'd given the facts to with enough restraint to make it truthful and not vindictive, called her into a meeting. She texted me that morning in a voice that betrayed panic masked by calm. She wrote, "They want me to come in." I didn't answer. I waited. Let the institutions react how they must. I had given them the truth. I wouldn't play judge and jury in the court of public spectacle.
When she came home that night, she looked hollow. Her eyes were red, not just from crying, but from the strain of being seen by people who had thought they knew her. The company didn't fire her immediately, but they placed her on leave, pending an investigation. It was a procedural step, but it created distance between her and the life she'd once depended on. Her confidence, a thing I'd once admired, folded inward like paper. Ryan's collapse was less formal, but no less devastating. His freelance clients started asking questions. A couple of them canceled projects citing concerns. Word travels fast in small networks, and reputation, the fragile scaffolding freelancers stand on, started to wobble. He called me once, voice thin and defenseless, saying, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But intention matters less than consequence. He'd built his life on a pattern of small deceptions. Patterns are easier to believe in than confessions. Their fights became frequent and public to those who are close enough to notice. It wasn't the movie-style screaming and slamming of doors. It was more corrosive. Long silences, quick answers, the habit of looking away in photographs. Friends started to report small stories. Emily canceling on a cousin at the last minute. Ryan showing up late to a family dinner and seeming distracted. Little failures accumulated like dust until they became unbearable. The first night I saw them actually break was surreal. They were at a dinner hosted by one of Emily's cousins. I didn't go, I didn't want to be the puppeteer of their downfall, but I'd heard about it through someone who was there. The story was simple. A comment, a look, a whispered accusation that cut deeper than any open confrontation. Emily stood, speechless, unable to set a narrative straight. Ryan tried to explain, but his words were small and tangled, and they only made him look more dishonest. People shifted in their chairs. The music on the speakers felt suddenly too loud. Later that week, Emily stormed into my apartment, breathless, furious, and broken in an odd mix. She had lost a client. She had been called into another meeting with HR. She was terrified. For a moment, I saw the old Emily, the one who used to laugh at clumsy jokes and dance in the kitchen, but then she looked at me and the look was different. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of naked exposure. She said, "You did this." Her voice wasn't accusing, it was hollow. "Yes," I said, "I showed the truth." The room hummed. She sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands like a child. I felt nothing heroic in that moment. I felt only the residue of love and its betrayal. I felt the small triumph of truth, but that triumph was muted by the sight of her so exposed and afraid. What surprised me was how quickly mutual friends took sides once the collapse gained momentum. A few who had hesitated now distanced themselves openly. Invitations stopped arriving. Photos on social media where they once smiled in groups began to omit them. The human instinct to avoid discomfort can be brutal when applied in mass. I watched it happen and felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Their relationship, once clothed in secrecy and stolen moments, began to fray in daylight. They argued about money, about where to live, about the simplest logistics of daily life that lovers usually solve together. Those conversations, when leaked, made them seem petty and ordinary rather than romantic and forbidden.
Romance dies when logistics remain. You can't maintain an affair when rent is due and someone needs to sign a lease. In the midst of their collapse, Ryan made a desperate attempt to salvage something, not with me, but within his social circle. He tried to rewrite past statements, to get friends to recant or minimize his actions. The effort looked desperate, like someone trying to stitch a torn garment with thread meant for embroidery. People who were loyal to him began to admit they had been misled. The cracks were too numerous to cover. There were moments that belonged purely to me, the small, private confirmations that the plan was working. I saw Ryan's car in the lot outside a cafe where he used to meet clients, but he sat alone, hunched over, watching the door instead of inside conversations. I watched Emily sit at a family lunch, a plate pushed aside as she fixed a smile that had lost its genuine warmth. These were not triumphant scenes. They were the quiet unmasking of two people who had built an alternate life and were forced to live in the one reality had given them. Then came the final domino, a recorded conversation, not violent, not salacious, just two people making plans without regard for the person they had hurt. I shared it with a trusted counselor and my lawyer first, not to gloat, but to ensure the chain of custody and the ethical handling of such material. It wasn't the first piece of evidence I had had, but it had the audible ring that photographs and texts sometimes lack. Voices are hard to see away from. They insist on being true. When that recording was disclosed in the context of the ongoing investigations at both their workplaces, the impact was clear. Statements were taken, HR escalated actions, and clients pulled back. For them, the world narrowed. The safety nets they had assumed would cushion the fall were gone. Watching their collapse, I learned something else about people who live with secrets. Secrecy breeds paranoia. They began to doubt everyone, to question motives, to sleep with phones facing inward. Trust, once breached, is hard to resurrect. They would call each other at odd hours, demand explanations, and then resent the answers. Love, when filtered through suspicion, becomes a cage.
As the weeks unfolded, I felt the tension inside me ease. Not because I had the power to end them, but because truth had done its work. The collapse was not my victory lap. It was the inevitable consequence of their choices catching up to them. That realization brought a complicated peace. I was no longer a man shaking with rage. I was a man who had used patience and precision, watched the consequences unfold, and learned how fragile human constructs are when built on lies. But collapse is messy. They lost clients, some friends, and a sense of normalcy. They faced judgment in quiet rooms, made apologies that sounded rehearsed, and tried to explain away their decisions with excuses that were thinner than tissue. I sat through a few mediated conversations where apologies were offered and rejected, where promises were made and later broken. The cycle of attempt and failure made them smaller in my eyes. In the final reckoning, they didn't implode in a blaze. They withered in daylight, exposed and ordinary. The dramatic ending I expected, a scene of catharsis or theatrical confrontation, never came. Instead, their lives simply rearranged around the new truth. Friends left, careers shifted, and nights that once felt secretive and thrilling became empty. On a rainy afternoon, months later, I passed Ryan on the street. He looked up, our eyes met, and for a fraction of a second, the old camaraderie flickered. Then it was gone. He nodded like an acquaintance. That small, mechanical nod was the end of a story that once felt like the entire world. The collapse caught me about consequence in a way nothing else could. It taught me that when people choose to betray, they don't just betray the person beside them, they betray a community of trust. More than that, it taught me that truth, when given space, has a gravity that slowly pulls everything back into alignment. It's not immediate or theatrical, it's inexorable. By the time the dust settled, they had lost much. Not everything. They still had limbs to stand on and the capacity to rebuild if they chose honestly, but they had lost the easier forms of life, unquestioned loyalty, casual trust, and the comfort of not being seen for what they were. The cost was real, and it hung in the air like a scent you can't quite wash away. And for me, I stood at a distance and watched. I felt the ache of what was lost,
the resignation that some parts of life could not be reclaimed, and the small, steady relief that truth had not been entirely buried. I did not dance on their ruin, I simply bore witness to its consequence. The strangest part about revenge is what comes after. When the dust finally settles, when the people who hurt you have paid their price, the silence that follows is unbearable. For months, I'd lived fueled by purpose. Every move, every thought, every sleepless night was directed toward one thing: justice. But once it was done, there was nothing left to fight against. And that emptiness was louder than any anger I had ever felt. The first morning after their collapse felt foreign. I woke up late, sunlight pouring through half-closed blinds, and for a moment I didn't recognize my own life. The apartment was still, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't check my phone to see if any new message or update had arrived. It was just me, alone, free, but uncertain of what freedom even meant anymore. The kitchen smelled like old coffee. The walls, once echoing with Emily's laughter, were now filled only with quiet breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stood there, staring at the mug in my hand, realizing that I had built my entire identity around pain. And now that the pain had nowhere left to go, I didn't know who I was anymore. That realization hit me harder than any betrayal ever did. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild, but rebuilding isn't like rewinding. You can't go back to the person you were before everything broke. You can only move forward, piece by fragile piece, trying to fit what remains into something resembling a life. I started small. Cleaning the house was my first step. Not because it was dirty, but because it was haunted. Every corner held a memory. The scent of her perfume still clung to the couch. Her favorite mug sat untouched on the shelf. I packed them away, not with rage, but with a kind of quiet ceremony. Each object I removed felt like closing a chapter. I didn't throw them out. I boxed them and took them to storage. I didn't want to erase the past. I just wanted distance. Erasing means forgetting, and forgetting means losing the lessons. I couldn't afford that. When I finished, the apartment looked empty. Not lonely, but ready. Ready for a new version of me to exist there.
Work became my anchor again. For a while, I had neglected it, pouring all my time into plotting revenge and keeping track of their downfall. Now I started staying late at the office, not out of desperation, but because structure felt safe. The hum of computers, the clack of keyboards, the coffee runs, they gave my days rhythm again. But even there, things had changed. Some colleagues treated me carefully, like I was fragile glass. Others avoided mentioning my name in gossip altogether, as if silence could protect them from the weight of my story. I didn't blame them. People fear emotional wreckage more than physical scars. Then, one afternoon, Sarah, the same coworker who used to remind me to eat breakfast, stopped by my desk. She didn't say much, just placed the small cactus beside my computer and said, "Low maintenance, but still alive. Like you." It sounds silly, but that tiny green plant became a symbol for me. Every morning, I'd water it, just a few drops, and whisper to myself, "You're still growing. Even here, even now." Rebuilding wasn't just about routine, though. It was about relearning how to feel safe in my own skin. I started therapy, something I never thought I'd need. The first session, I barely spoke. I just sat there staring at my hands. The therapist said, "You've been living in survival mode for too long. Let's figure out what peace looks like for you." Peace? I almost laughed. It had become a foreign concept. But she was right. I'd been surviving, calculating, reacting, watching, never breathing freely. And so, little by little, I began to unpack not the betrayal itself, but its weight. There's a moment in healing that no one talks about, when forgiveness isn't about the other person, but about freeing yourself from their shadow. I didn't forgive Emily or Ryan in a single moment. It wasn't cinematic. It was gradual, reluctant, and silent.
I forgave them the day I stopped thinking about them before falling asleep. That was the real victory. Not their loss, but my peace. As I rebuilt, I began reconnecting with people I'd pushed away, old friends, family, even coworkers I'd been too distant with. Some came back eagerly, others hesitated, not sure if I was ready. But each conversation chipped away at the isolation I'd built around myself. One evening, my father called. His voice was gentler than I remembered. "I heard about what happened with them," he said. I sighed. "It's over now." "Good," he replied. "Then it's time you live again, son. Don't spend your life staring in the rearview mirror. There's nothing back there worth your eyes." That line stayed with me. Nothing back there worth your eyes. So I started driving. Literally. Weekend road trips, no destination. Just open roads, music, and the strange comfort of not knowing where I'd end up. Some drives ended in small towns where no one knew my name. I'd sit at diners, sipping coffee, watching people live normal lives. There was something healing about anonymity, about existing without the weight of the betrayed husband. Months passed, seasons changed, and so did I. By spring, I found myself smiling without forcing it. The laughter came slower, but it came. The scars remained, of course, but they stopped defining me. People think healing means forgetting. It doesn't. Healing means remembering without pain. One afternoon, I received a message from an unknown number. It was Emily. "I'm sorry for everything. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. I wish I had realized it sooner." I stared at the message for a long time. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally realized I didn't need to say anything. Forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes silence is closure. So I deleted the message, not out of anger, but peace. For the first time, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was final. Around that same time, Ryan left town. Someone mentioned he'd taken a job in another city, something low profile. Good for him, I thought. People can change, or at least try to. I didn't hate him anymore. I just didn't care. And that's the truest form of letting go. Indifference. When their names no longer stir emotion, you know you've rebuilt yourself completely. That summer, I started volunteering at a youth mentorship program, helping young adults with career planning and emotional wellness. It wasn't a grand, life-changing act. It just felt right. Helping others find clarity gave my pain meaning. The same wounds that once destroyed me became lessons for others. One evening after a session, a student asked me, "Sir, how do you move on from people who break you?" I smiled, looking at the fading sunset through the window, and said, "You don't move on from them. You move on with what you learned. The hurt is a teacher, not a prison." He nodded quietly, and I saw myself in his eyes. Lost, angry, trying to understand the world's unfairness. It was in that moment I realized I'd come full circle. Rebuilding a life after betrayal isn't about finding someone new or erasing memories. It's about reclaiming your identity, piece by piece, until one day you wake up and realize the storm is behind you, not above you.
I still carry the memories, the lessons, and the faint ache of what once was. But now they don't weigh me down. They remind me of who I've become. Someone stronger, wiser, and unshakably self-aware.
Pain broke me, yes, but pain also rebuilt me with cleaner edges and a clearer heart. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You can lose everything. Love, trust, certainty, and still find yourself again. Not as the person you were, but as the person you were always meant to become. For a long time, I thought love was a chapter forever closed in my book. The scars my wife and best friend left behind were deep. Not just emotional, but spiritual. Trust felt like a foreign language I'd forgotten how to speak. Every time I saw someone smile at me with kindness, I wondered what they really wanted. Every time someone said, "I care," I questioned if they meant it. But life has its own rhythm. Sometimes healing doesn't come with a bang, it comes softly, quietly, like the sound of rain after a long drought. It started with a woman named Sarah. She wasn't anyone special at first. She worked in a small publishing firm I freelanced for after the divorce. Our conversations were professional, about deadlines, word counts, and revisions. But she had a calmness about her, something that felt safe. She didn't force me to open up. She didn't try to fix me. She just listened. One day, after a long meeting, she said something that stayed with me. You can rebuild anything, even trust. You just have to build it with someone who values it. Her words echoed in my mind long after she left the room. I didn't realize it then, but that was the first time in years I'd felt seen. Not as a victim, not as a man with a broken heart, but simply as a person. Over the next few months, we began to spend more time together. Lunch turned into coffee, coffee turned into long evening walks. And in those walks, I rediscovered something I thought I'd lost: laughter. Sarah didn't ask about my past until I was ready to talk about it. And when I finally did, she didn't pity me. She just said, "You went through hell, but you didn't stay there. That says everything." I realized that was true. For so long, I had been defining myself by what happened to me. But maybe it was time to define myself by what I did after. There were still moments of fear. Once, she reached for my phone to show me something funny, and my body tensed up instinctively. I saw her notice, the way her smile faded just a bit, and I immediately apologized. She didn't pull away. She just said quietly, "It's okay. You don't have to rush to trust me." That simple sentence broke something in me. Not in a painful way, but like a knot finally coming undone. For the first time since my wife's betrayal, I allowed someone new to walk into my life slowly, gently. My friends noticed the change before I did. "You're smiling again," one of them said. And they were right, I was. It wasn't the wild, careless happiness I once had. It was calmer, grounded, real. With Sarah, I learned that love doesn't always have to burn bright and loud. Sometimes it's a steady flame, quiet, dependable, warm. It doesn't demand, it doesn't pretend, it just is. A few months later, we took a small weekend trip to the mountains. The air was cold and fresh, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. Standing there, overlooking the valley, Sarah slipped her hand into mine. "Do you still think about them?" she asked softly. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. I don't think about what they did to me anymore. I think about what I learned because of it." She smiled, looking at me with that calm certainty I had come to love. "Then maybe it was all meant to lead you here." I didn't respond right away. I just looked out at the horizon, the vast stretch of mountains and sky, and for once, I didn't feel like something had been taken from me. I felt like something had been returned. That night, sitting by a small fire, I thought about how far I'd come. There was a time when my life was all about revenge, about making them pay for what they did. But now, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. Healing wasn't forgetting. It was forgiving myself for staying broken too long. And love, real love, wasn't about filling a void. It was about building something new from the ashes, together. When I looked at Sarah, I saw not a replacement for my past, but the promise of a future, one built on respect, kindness, and truth. For the first time, I whispered something to myself. I'm free. And this time, I meant it.
It had been almost 2 years since the storm ended. My life had changed completely. I moved to a new part of town, started my own small business, and found peace in the quiet routines I once took for granted. But as they say, the past doesn't disappear. It waits. It lingers in the corners of your life, biding its time until it decides to knock again. And one cold evening in November, it did. It was a Sunday. I remember because Sarah was making tea, humming softly to herself while I sorted out some invoices. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, my heart froze. Standing there was her, my ex-wife. Time had not been kind to her. Her face looked pale, thinner than before. The spark she once had, the confident glow, was gone. Her eyes were hollow, like someone who hadn't slept in months. For a moment, we just stared at each other in silence. Then she said softly, "Hi, Armin." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body was stiff, my throat tight. All those years of betrayal, rage, and heartbreak suddenly pressed down on me again. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, and my ex-wife's eyes flicked toward her. There was a flash of guilt there, maybe jealousy. I couldn't tell. I just need 5 minutes," she said quietly. I hesitated, but stepped aside. I didn't do it for her. I did it for myself. I needed to know what she wanted, to end whatever thread was still dangling between us. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands trembling as she spoke. "I know I'm the last person you ever wanted to see," she began, her voice breaking. "But I came to say, I'm sorry, truly sorry." I folded my arms, watching her. "Sorry for what, exactly?" I asked flatly. "For everything," she whispered. "For betraying you, for lying, for destroying everything we had. I've paid for it, Armin, more than you can imagine." She went on to tell me how my former best friend, the man she cheated with, had left her months after their affair was exposed. Apparently, he'd used her, drained her savings, and vanished when things got hard. She was alone now, living in a rented room, struggling to find work. For a long moment, I said nothing. Part of me wanted to feel pity. Another part of me wanted to say, "You deserve it." But what I actually felt was nothing, just emptiness. "She didn't come here for pity," she continued. "I just needed you to know that I realized what I lost, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life." As she spoke, I realized something important. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you. It's about freeing yourself from the poison that's been eating at you for years. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconnection. It doesn't mean you open your door to the same people who burned your home. So, I looked at her and said calmly, "I forgave you a long time ago. That doesn't mean I want you in my life." She nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. "I understand," she whispered. "Thank you for at least hearing me out." When she left, I stood by the door for a long time, staring into the empty night. I felt lighter, not happy, not sad, just free. A week later, I got a message from my former best friend. It came out of nowhere, I heard you met her. I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry too. For a few seconds, I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond, and I typed one line. There's nothing left to say, and I meant it. Some stories don't deserve sequels. That night, Sarah noticed I was quieter than usual. We sat on the balcony, the city lights glowing softly below us. She took my hand and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, just finally closed the last door."
She smiled gently. Sometimes closure doesn't come when you want it to, but when it does, it changes everything. I looked at her and realized she was right. The anger that once defined me was gone. The bitterness, the obsession with revenge, the constant replaying of the past, all of it had faded. I wasn't the man who'd been betrayed anymore. I was the man who survived it. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, it just released its grip on my present. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, the final stage of healing. The storm that began with betrayal had finally ended with peace. But as I'd soon learn, peace doesn't mean perfection. Even when you forgive others, sometimes you must still forgive yourself for the years you lost, the mistakes you made, and the person you became because of pain. And that was my next battle. It had been almost 2 years since the storm ended. My life had changed completely. I'd moved to a new part of town, started my own small business, and found peace in the quiet routines I once took for granted. But as they say, the past doesn't disappear. It waits. It lingers in the corners of your life, biding its time until it decides to knock again. And one cold evening in November, it did. It was a Sunday. I remember because Sarah was making tea, humming softly to herself while I sorted out some invoices. The doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, my heart froze. Standing there was her, my ex-wife. Time had not been kind to her. Her face looked pale, thinner than before. The spark she once had, the confident glow, was gone. Her eyes were hollow, like someone who hadn't slept in months. For a moment, we just stared at each other in silence. Then she said softly, "Hi, Armand." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body was stiff, my throat tight. All those years of betrayal, rage, and heartbreak suddenly pressed down on me again. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, and my ex-wife's eyes flicked toward her. There was a flash of guilt there. Maybe jealousy? I couldn't tell. She said, "I just need 5 minutes." I hesitated but stepped aside. I didn't do it for her, I did it for myself. I needed to know what she wanted, to end whatever thread was still dangling between us. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands trembling as she spoke. "I know I'm the last person you ever wanted to see, but I came to say I'm sorry. Truly sorry." I folded my arms and watched her. "Sorry for what, exactly?" I asked flatly. "For everything," she whispered. "For betraying you, for lying, for destroying everything we had. I've paid for it, Armand, more than you can imagine." She went on to tell me how my former best friend, the man she cheated with, had left her months after their affair was exposed. Apparently he'd used her, drained her savings, and vanished when things got hard. She was alone now, living in a rented room, struggling to find work. For a long moment, I said nothing. Part of me wanted to feel pity. Another part of me wanted to say, "You deserve it." But what I actually felt was nothing. Just emptiness. She didn't come here for pity.
she continued. I just needed you to know that I realize what I lost, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life. As she spoke, I realized something important. Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you. It's about freeing yourself from the poison that's been eating at you for years. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconnection. It doesn't mean you open your door to the same people who burned your home. So I looked at her and said calmly, I forgave you a long time ago, but that doesn't mean I want you in my life. She nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. I understand, she whispered. Thank you for at least hearing me out. When she left, I stood by the door for a long time, staring into the empty night. I felt lighter, not happy, not sad, just free. A week later, I got a message from my former best friend. It came out of nowhere. I heard you met her. I know you hate me, and you have every right to do so. But I just wanted to say I'm sorry too.
For a few seconds, I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Then I typed one line. There's nothing left to say. And I meant it. Some stories don't deserve sequels. That night, Sarah noticed I was quieter than usual. We sat on the balcony, the city lights glowing softly below us. She took my hand and asked, "Are you okay?" I nodded, "Yeah, just finally closed the last door." She smiled gently. Sometimes closure doesn't come when you want it to. But when it does, it changes everything. I looked at her and realized she was right. The anger that once defined me was gone. The bitterness, the obsession with revenge, the constant replaying of the past, all of it had faded away. I wasn't the man who'd been betrayed anymore. I was the man who survived it. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, it just released its grip on my present. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The final stage of healing. The storm that began with betrayal had finally ended with peace. But as I'd soon learn, peace doesn't mean perfection. Even when you forgive others, sometimes you must still forgive yourself. For the years you lost, the mistakes you made, and the person you became because of pain. And that was my next battle. They say time heals all wounds, but I've learned that's only half true. Time doesn't heal anything by itself. What heals you is what you choose to do with that time. For years, I carried the weight of betrayal like a shadow that followed me everywhere. Even when I smiled, it was there. Even when I tried to move on, it whispered reminders of what I'd lost. But now, standing on the other side of that darkness, I can finally see the full picture. Not of what they did to me, but of what I became because of it. This isn't a story about revenge anymore. It's a story about freedom. After my ex-wife's visit and my final message to my former best friend, life settled into a calm rhythm. I kept working on my business, spent weekends hiking with Sarah, and sometimes just sat in silence, watching the sunset. And in those quiet moments, I realized something powerful. The peace I'd been chasing wasn't something anyone could give me. It was something I had to create for myself. One evening, I was sorting through old boxes, things I hadn't touched since the divorce, when I came across our old wedding photo. For a moment, I stared at it. 2 smiling faces, so full of dreams and promises. It almost felt like looking at strangers. I didn't feel anger this time, just acceptance. Because the truth is, people change.
Sometimes they grow apart. Sometimes they make mistakes so big they destroy everything. But that doesn't mean your story ends there. I took that photo, placed it back in the box, and wrote one word on the lid. Past. Then I sealed it and put it away. Not out of hatred, but as a sign that chapter was truly over. In the months that followed, I started mentoring young entrepreneurs who were going through setbacks of their own. I told them something I wished someone had told me years ago. You can't control what people do to you, but you can always control how you respond. And that, I realized, was the essence of every lesson I'd learned. Revenge might give you a moment of satisfaction, but healing gives you a lifetime of peace. Sarah and I eventually moved to a quieter part of the city, near a small lake surrounded by trees. Every morning, I'd sit by the water with my coffee and watch the ripples. Sometimes I'd think about the past, not with pain, but with gratitude. Because without that betrayal, I wouldn't have discovered who I truly was. Pain had broken me down, but it also rebuilt me into something stronger. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Sarah sat beside me and said, "You know, I've never seen anyone turn so much pain into purpose." I smiled and replied, "Maybe that's what life is about. Not avoiding pain, but learning how to use it."
She leaned on my shoulder, and for a while neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd endured, everything we'd become. Looking back, I can see every stage of my journey clearly now. The shock, when I found out about the betrayal. The anger, when I wanted to destroy everything that hurt me. The revenge, when I tried to find justice in their downfall. The emptiness, when I realized revenge didn't fill the hole inside me. The healing, when I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. And finally, the freedom, when I let go. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this. Forgiveness doesn't make you weak. It doesn't mean you forget or accept what happened. It means you choose your peace over their memory. It means you refuse to let their actions define your story any longer. Sometimes people ask me, "Do you ever wish it never happened?" And I always say, no, because it shaped me into the person I was meant to be. Without that pain, I might never have discovered what true strength, true love, and true freedom really feel like. My final lesson. Life will test you in ways you can't imagine. People you trust may betray you. Dreams may collapse, and your heart may shatter into 1,000 pieces. But when it does, don't let it make you bitter. Let it make you better. Because one day, you'll look back and realize the storm that tried to break you was actually the thing that washed you clean. So to anyone who's listening, who's been betrayed, hurt, or left behind, remember this. You don't owe anyone your anger forever. You don't owe anyone your pain. You owe yourself peace. Take it, hold it, and walk forward free. From betrayal to freedom. The end of one story, the beginning of another.